Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining this seminar. We're lucky tonight. I'm Greg Austin from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I lead our cyber, space and future conflict. And tonight we're going to be talking about Russia cyber coercion. Just a couple of housekeeping matters to start with. If you'd like to raise a question or a comment for the end of the session, feel free to do so by raising your hand through the raise hand function. We prefer that way to just have a voice-to-voice conversation. We don't have to do it that way. If you'd like to raise a question in the chat box through the Q&A, we can also do that. But we're looking forward to a decent time for question and comment at the end of the presentations. So let me introduce our speakers. And we're very privileged today to have two people who have come from quite different career paths into this subject of Russian cyber policy. And first, let me present Bilyana Lilly from the RAND Corporation. Bilyana's just finished her graduate studies, but I'm sure she's got heaps of professional experience before that, which speaks directly to the subject tonight. She signed a book contract, which for a publication early next year. And she's currently serving as the Pardee Fellow at the RAND Graduate School. Joining Bilyana is Dr Ofer Fridman, Director of Operations at King's College Centre for Strategic Communications. And Ofer has several books to his credit, one of which is close by if you wanted to reach it, Ofer, and just hold it up, because I think it's a really important book. Pretty good credentials for the discussions we're having tonight. Thanks, Ofer. Russia's Russian hybrid warfare. So both of the presenters tonight have got excellent research credentials on this subject. So we're looking forward really to a rich and informative conversation. Each speaker will speak for about 25-30 minutes, leaving us plenty of time for comment and conversation questions at the end. So we'll kick off with Bilyana, if you'd be so kind. Bilyana, thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg, for this wonderful introduction. I will share my screen and let me know if you can see it.
Yes, it's coming up. Yeah.
Fantastic. And before I begin, I just wanted to express my gratitude for being here. Greg, thank you for inviting me. And also I wanted to show how much I respect IISS's work. I still have on my wall a map of Russia's armed forces from the military balance from 2015. It's been on my wall for about 3 years to inspire my work. So thank you so much for your work, especially for the important work that you're doing. So without further ado, today I will discuss how Russia uses cyber operations in its attempts to coerce states into making decisions that benefit Russia. I will first briefly discuss Russia's concept of information warfare because it provides context for how Russia uses cyber operations. I will also briefly talk about the role of cyber operations in Russia's information warfare doctrine. I will then demonstrate how Russia uses cyber operations in different cases, and I will briefly assess their effectiveness. So what is information warfare? Over the past 2 decades, Russia's military and political leadership tends to have reached a consensus that the baseline for warfare has shifted from an understanding that the baseline of warfare is armed violence to an understanding that the baseline of warfare is now armed violence and non-military measures. And that shift is exemplified in the concept of information warfare. Here, I'm providing a very brief generalization and oversimplified version, and I'm sure Ofer has a lot more nuance to add, but for 30 minutes, I will just walk you through some of the basics. One of the definitions of the concept is provided in Russia's 2011 concept on activities in the information space. And based on that document, information warfare is the confrontation between 2 or more states in the information space. This type of warfare could be conducted continuously. It could be conducted during peace and war, or at least in the way we define it formally. And based on this definition, information warfare has 4 purposes that were listed here. They are to inflict damage on information systems, processes, and resources that are critical and also other structures, to undermine the political, economic, and social systems of a particular state, to conduct massive psychological manipulation of the population, to destabilize the state and society, and finally, to coerce the state to take decisions for the benefit of the opposing force. So coercing a state into behaving in a certain way that's in accordance with Russia's interests is already in the definition of information warfare. And here you can see that information warfare has a technical and a psychological component. Russian scholars tend to agree that some of the core methods that are used to conduct information warfare are cyber operations and psychological operations. And psychological operations tend to be conducted to manipulate either a segment of the population of the targeted state, the entire population of the targeted state, just the leadership or the military of the particular state. There are various opinions among different Russian military scholars on what other methods are used to conduct information warfare, but they also some of them tend to agree that other non-military activities such as economic coercion or sanctions, political coercion, diplomatic coercion, or diplomatic measures in general can also be considered a part of information warfare. On this slide, I have listed some of the cyber operations that have been attributed to the Russian government over the recent years. Those cyber operations are not conducted in a strategic vacuum. They're usually conducted alongside other activities that fall under the understanding of information warfare, according to Russian military literature and scholars. And those cyber operations tend to have short-term as well as long-term objectives. In the short term, they could be, if those cyber operations were conducted during election processes in certain states, the short-term objective may be Russia's preference for one candidate over another, but a long-term objectives of information warfare also tends to be an attempt to erode democratic cohesion and societal cohesion in a particular community. And in order to demonstrate exactly how this works in practice, I'm going to look at 4 case studies. First, and here I have just provided a few icons for them. The first is the 2007 cyber operations against Estonia. The second is Russia's interference in the 2016 US elections, then Russia's attempt to also interfere and influence the 2017 French elections. And finally, I'll briefly discuss Russia's operations in the context of the 2020 US elections, because it's an election that recently happened and there was a lot of attention to it. I thought it would be important to mention it. I will very briefly talk about these cases because I don't have much time, but I'm more than happy to address your questions in the Q&A afterwards. So what do we know about Estonia in 2007? Well, that's the case that set cyber operations as a tool of warfare and placed cyber operations on the map of strategic studies. Because this is the very first case where a state used cyber operations to such a massive degree against another state. And the reason for the particular operations was rather interesting, perhaps not something that you would consider as important to result in an actual cyber operation of this scale. The reason was that the Estonian government decided to relocate a statue of a bronze soldier from the center of Estonia, from the center of Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, to a more peripheral location. And Russia was considered this an affront. The statue isn't that big. I'll show you a photo of it in a few slides. I actually visited it 2 years ago to pay my respects. The statue is actually not as significant if you look at it from just the perspective of an actual creation, an actual statue, but it had a significant historical and cultural value because it represented the Soviet liberation of Estonia from Nazi Germany. And that's why it was a very important element in Russia's history and a very important symbol based on Russia's history to the Russian government. What happened as a result of the relocation was that the Russian government expressed discontent and disagreement with Estonia's decision. And one of the reactions in which the Russian government responded to the relocation of the statue was with a series of cyber operations against different Estonian targets. Those included political parties, ministries, the Estonian government, banks, and media, and other targets as well. They were usually not critical, but they still resulted in disruption of services and operations and communications. Different scholars group the types of cyber attacks in different waves, and those cyber attacks included DDoS attacks as well as SQL injections that resulted in defacement of websites. Some scholars group them in 3 waves, some group them in 4. I've here decided to group them in 3. But in addition to the cyber operations, there were a number of other activities that the Russian government was involved in during this period that we can now understand as one information warfare campaign. And here I have listed some of them. In order to visualize them, I have used a framework that I created that is called, and I've called it CHAOS. CHAOS stands for cyber, hype in Russian-sponsored media, and associated operations. And with this framework, I try to capture the main elements of Russia's information warfare operations in particular cases. And in my research, I'm applying the same framework to about a dozen cases, and I'm trying to look for differences and commonalities across cases. And such a standardized approach helps me to visualize them easier and to very quickly compare across them. I won't have time here to elaborate on the framework, but if you're interested in learning more about it, I published last year a short article for the CyberWire where I talk about the framework, and I encourage you to look at that. So what do we have on this slide? We have political activities and rhetoric. Those are activities that were conducted by the Russian government or with the substantial support of the Russian government. And here I have listed two of the main ones. After the decision, the Estonian government announced its decision that it will relocate the statue, Russia sent a delegation of Duma representatives to Tallinn to try to defuse tensions and change Estonia's mind. Also, a number of Russian politicians publicly expressed discontent with Estonia's decision. And one of the main events where this happened was Putin's Victory Day speech, where he criticized Estonia for desecrating the history of the two countries by deciding to move or relocate the soldier. Under economic activities, I've listed a number of economic activities that were related to this crisis or to this situation. One of them was the so-called hidden sanctions on certain Estonian goods. There was also a cancellation of oil goods to Estonia for a short period, specifically related to the relocation of the soldier. Because of the decision to relocate the soldier, a number of protests happened in Estonia, in Tallinn, as well as around the Estonian embassy in Moscow, and I have listed here both of them. Under mitigation policies and events, we have a number of policies that the Estonian government introduced as the crisis was unfolding in order to try to mitigate its effects. And here on the media coverage, as I already mentioned, one of the ways through which Russia conducts information warfare is through psychological operations and strategic messaging. And here I have tried to capture that by looking at the media coverage of Russian state-sponsored media that were available to Estonians during the time as the crisis was unfolding, as a way to try to understand Russia's messaging towards the targeted state. And specifically here on the shaded area that is right now highlighted in red along the x-axis, you can see the daily number of articles about Estonia and the Bronze Soldier that were published in top Russian military and internet agencies available to Estonians in this period. And you can clearly see, this is basically the volume of information. You can clearly see that there are several spikes in reporting, or this is the H in chaos, hypes in media, state-sponsored media, and those spikes have occurred exactly before the major waves of cyber operations happened, as well as around the times where there were protests in Tallinn and in Moscow. And so we can see some sort of visible correlation here that can also lead us to conclude, if we see this across different cases of Russian information warfare, that there may be causation between an increase in media reporting or strategic messaging and particular events such as protests and cyber operations. And in this particular case, my hypothesis is that because some of those cyber operations also necessitated the involvement of a number of patriotic hackers or non-state actors that launched campaigns alongside the Russian government, the spike in media might have been an attempt by the Russian government to increase support, to raise awareness about the attacks that were coming, and to basically attract more of those Russian sympathizers or ethnic Russians or actual Russian citizens on its side in order to help with those operations. So how about the effectiveness? How effective were Russia's cyber operations in this particular case? Well, if we look at the cyber operations in isolation, the short-term effects could easily have, or the short-term objective could easily have been the disruption of websites and servers and the proper communication that those servers and websites supported. So that was disrupted, but only temporarily. And if we look at the whole strategy holistically and the whole incident holistically and try to understand, did Russia achieve its objectives? Well, the reason why all of these activities started was because of the relocation of the bronze soldier, or Estonia's decision to relocate the bronze soldier. Well, did Estonia relocate the bronze soldier? It did. The soldier is healthy, standing still in Tallinn, just not in the center of Tallinn, but in a peripheral location near a cemetery. I visited, as I mentioned, 2 years ago, and so the soldier was relocated. That particular goal, Russia didn't manage to achieve a change in Estonia's decision. And there were some consequences, probably unintended, that resulted from Russia's operations that would suggest also that Russia's operations were not only ineffective, but also perhaps had the opposite result of what the Russian government aimed to achieve. First of all, there was an increased international support for Estonia in this period to try to help Estonia to mitigate the effects of cyber operations quickly. Also, NATO created the Cyber Center of Excellence, CCDCOE, in Estonia as a result of the attacks. The center is fantastic. It's located actually not far away from the soldier himself. And the center also organizes on an annual basis a very good conference called CyCon, a conference on cyber conflict, which gathers an impressive number of thinkers in this field. And I strongly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this field. And another long-term consequence was from, for example, from the impact of sanctions that were imposed on, or silent sanctions that were imposed on Estonia, might have been the attempt to damage Estonia's economy. We have a very good report that was published this year by an Estonian think tank that shows that the impact of those sanctions was also negligible. So overall, I think this particular case shows that Russia's use of cyber operations was not necessarily effective because it did not necessarily achieve the stated objectives. Another case I wanted to examine is the case of Russia's interference in the US 2016 elections. This is probably one of the most well-researched cases. We have a number of reports from different US government agencies that elaborate on the different aspects of Russia's operations in this period. Here, we know, I've listed only a few of them. We know that Russia conducted intelligence gathering several years before the elections even started, and information that was collected through that intelligence operation was later on used to refine Russia's activities and that were aimed at interfering with the elections. So intelligence gathering was one of the elements. Another one was illegal impersonation of US citizens, exploitation of US-based computer infrastructure. Also, we now know from a number of reports that Russia also used extensively US social media platforms, specifically Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, through an organization that was called, or through a company that was called the Internet Research Agency and was based in St. Petersburg. Russia used a number of trolls or paid bloggers and bots to proliferate some of its messages, to generate content that was usually critical of Hillary Clinton and some other candidates, and usually very, very positive of candidate Donald Trump. But also those messages created a lot of divisive messages that were touching upon sensitive topics for the American public at this time, that included police brutality, discrimination, religion, immigration, and a lot of similar issues. Also, through social media, specifically through trolls that were sitting in St. Petersburg, Russia managed to organize a series of rallies in different US states that involved a lot of Americans, wittingly or unwittingly. Also, Russia used its state-sponsored media available in the United States, specifically Sputnik and RT, to spread strategic messaging and some disinformation that was along the lines of Russia's interests in this particular election. One of the main elements that we're, of course, very interested in here is the series of cyber operations that Russia conducted against election IT infrastructure in the United States. We now know from quite a lot of different analyses that Russia tried to at least scan the networks and sometimes breach the networks of election IT infrastructure in all 50 states. But the major campaign that we hear about is the hack and leak operation that Russian GRU and SVR operatives launched against the DNC, or the Democratic National Committee, and the subsequent release of information that resulted from that operation. So here I have listed, I've used, again, my chaos framework to list some of the main components of Russia's activities in this period that constitute Russia's information warfare operation against US elections in 2016. Here, of course, first we have the government activities. The framework is very similar to it, or identical to the one that I showed you that I applied to the case of Estonia. Here we have government activities that are activities that were conducted by the Russian government or Russian government actors or with the support of Russian government actors. Under social activities here, I have listed some of those rallies that Russian state-sponsored trolls and bots organized via Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms. Some of those rallies were gathered a lot of Americans, but also some of them were very graphic. In one particular case, Russia sponsored an American actress to dress as Hillary Clinton in a prison uniform and sponsored also or paid another American to build a cage for that actress to be placed in during a protest. Under mitigation policies, similar to the case of Estonia, I've listed a number of policies that the US government initiated as this operation was happening. And I'm happy to discuss afterwards how effective we think those policies were. A very good and very detailed report by the Senate Intelligence Committee in the United States conducted interviews with some of the officials that were part of those policies, and they seem to believe that their interactions with their Russian counterparts at the time and warnings that they gave them in that time were effective indeed in changing Russia's behavior and Russia's calculus in this period. Under media coverage here, similar to the case of Estonia, I've tried to capture Russia's strategic messaging in this time, specifically by looking at the number of articles about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, which were the main contenders for the presidency here, that were published in Russian media available to Americans in this period. And here I have listed, although now we know there were a lot of different attempts at cyber intrusions of different election IT infrastructure components all across the United States, I have listed here the main cyber operations that resulted in leaked information, and those were the operations conducted against the DNC and its sister organization by GRU and SVR operatives, or specifically by Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, as we know, the two advanced persistent threat actors. As a result of the successful breach of the servers of the DNC, the GRU operatives afterwards successfully released a lot of the information that they managed to obtain for this hack, and it contained confidential or private information from personal communication. It also included reports that the Democratic Party has written on other candidates and other parties. That information was released through the fake persona Guccifer 2.0 and through a platform that was created again by the GRU, which is known as DC Leaks. WikiLeaks was also involved. GRU also passed a lot of that information through WikiLeaks that subsequently released it. And here, we can see the clear integration of cyber operations in Russia's strategic messaging, because here the red arrow points at the number of articles that pertain to the DNC leaks and were a part of the overall coverage by Sputnik in this period. And you can see here that the number of the articles that were focused on the DNC leaks increased close to election day. But another interesting element that this table also, this visualization also shows is that the media coverage about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump didn't stop after election day. It actually increased in comparison to the months before. And this is in line with Russia's general strategy of information warfare that dictates that information warfare is a continuous process. And Russia conducts these operations not only because in particular cases it's interested in having one candidate elected over the other, but also because a long-term, more malicious objective is to try to erode public trust and confidence in democratic institutions and governance structures. And this analysis, and specifically this piece of evidence here, can suggest and point to that. How about the effects? Were Russian cyber operations effective, specifically in this case? Well, here, the outcome is more nuanced, and we're not really sure. I've listed some of the direct effects that we can attribute to the attacks and can say, okay, the Russian government actually had some success here. First, the leaked information that was obtained through the DNC hack resulted in the resignation of the DNC chairwoman, Debbie Wasserman-Schultz. That's a big success. The chairwoman of the whole DNC resigned because of the leak. Second, if we look at the media reach that Russian trolls had on social media, just by looking at what Facebook reported, Facebook, likely the messages that were generated or the content that was generated by Russian trolls that were sitting in St. Petersburg might have reached a little over 130 million social media users. So that's quite a reach. That said, what is really interesting here is we don't really know how much that information impacted the voters, whether it actually changed voters' opinion. And that's why here I have under election outcome a question mark, because it is really hard to determine how much of the information and the activities that were conducted with the support of the Russian government influenced the election results in American voters. Up to this date, we do not have a single methodologically rigorous study that can say for sure whether Russia's interference resulted in changing votes or not. And this is the big question here. If it actually did, yes, then the operation was hugely successful. If it didn't, then perhaps it wasn't. So there are also a number of negative consequences that resulted from Russia's interference. First of all, there were sanctions and also indictments against Russian operatives. There were a number of Russian state representatives who were expelled from the United States, and a US-based Russian diplomatic facility was also closed down. Positive consequences for the United States from Russia's operations were that now we have raised awareness among government agencies as well as the private sector about Russia's potential modus operandi and future operations. And the US government, as much as we criticize it, conducted a series of policies and series of activities that I believe helped a lot to enhance our resilience, especially this year, and improve our defenses against future interference. For example, DHS designated the election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, which resulted in a lot more resources focused on that infrastructure, training for local officials, and so on. Also, there was a raised awareness among social media providers, and specifically Facebook and Twitter, that resulted in a number of policies and steps that both of those companies took in order to try to protect our elections and improve media literacy among their users. And of course, I'm happy to discuss more specific policies in the Q&A and answer your questions about this. The last case I quickly want to cover, because we don't have, I believe I have about 5 minutes left, is the Russian interference in the 2017 elections in France. So Russia tried to recreate some of the potential success that it had in the 2016 US elections by trying to also penetrate or breach the servers of then the French presidential candidate Emmanuel Macron and release information obtained through this particular cyber operation. So to give you a brief background for the ones that haven't really read about this case, there were two presidential candidates that became particularly prominent in the French elections that took place in May. Those were Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, and Russia has clearly expressed reference for Marine Le Pen and her party. Months before the elections, Russia, for example, even financially contributed to the party that Marine Le Pen was leading. And in this particular case, Russia's operations don't seem to be as substantial and as large scale as they were in the 2016 elections, but this is based on the official information that we have. I have to caveat this because there may be a lot of activities that the Russians have tried to conduct or conducted during this period in France, but we just don't have information about that that's publicly available that I can analyze. But here we again have series of cyber operations against Macron's political campaign that resulted in successful breach of the servers of Macron's campaign and access to some of the private communication of Macron's associates. And as a result, information from this hack was also leaked through different platforms. One of them was archive.org. WikiLeaks also at some point created a database of the so-called Macron leaks that was searchable. But that particular hack and leak operation did not result. It didn't generate nearly the hype of attention that the US, that the equivalent hack and leak information the 2016 US elections generated. So here I've also listed the media coverage in this period, which is the number of articles about Emmanuel Macron and Le Pen that were published in Russian media available to the French population in this period. I specifically used Sputnik in French here to generate this analysis. And you can see there were spikes in media reporting about the two candidates around the two election rounds in France. But in terms of how much of that coverage pertained to the leaks that resulted from the cyber operations, that was very minimal. And this is it basically with the red light. The red arrow points at the very, very small fraction or portion of coverage that was pertaining to the Macron leaks here. So how about the success of this operation? Well, it didn't seem that it was that successful. Macron won, and he's right now the president of France. And there were a number of negative effects resulting from this for Russia and for Russia's institutions in France. First of all, RT and Sputnik were designated as organs of influence. There was no known significant social media campaign that was launched on Twitter or Facebook or any other platform by Russian operatives. It doesn't mean it didn't exist. It means that we don't really have information about it, and it doesn't seem that there was any from what I have read so far. There were no particularly salacious details that were uncovered through the hack of Macron's campaign, and there was no known measurable damage on Macron's reputation. So overall, Russia's operations, and specifically cyber operations, and the general information warfare campaign against Macron in this particular case didn't seem to be very effective. How about the 2020 US elections? We know very little about Russia's operations in this period. We have two reports from ODNI, or the Office of Director of National Intelligence, released in July and August, and they're more like press releases than actual reports that identified Russia, Iran, and China as the free state actors that are actively trying to interfere with the US elections or have a position in US elections. But there wasn't much information on what specific cyber operations the Russian government was behind. There were some private sector reports, for example, from Microsoft, that indicated that the GRU or GRU operatives, Fancy Bear most likely, were trying to penetrate government agencies and political parties, political campaigns in relation to the US elections, but we don't really have more information at this stage. Based on the publicly available evidence, it is safe to conclude that Russia's activities, at least based on the information that we have so far, against the 2020 elections were minimal in comparison to Russia's activities against the 2016 elections. So it's very early to say whether any of those operations were successful or not. And this concludes my presentation. If you found the information I provided valuable, as Greg already mentioned, I will be releasing a book that looks at those cases as well as about a dozen others next year. So look for that, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Bilyana, for an absolutely first-class presentation. Lots of interesting data, and from our point of view, very focused on the strategic outcomes. And I didn't mention at the start, but IISS is undertaking a project on cyber coercion now, looking at Russia, China, and the United States, but also at Iran and North Korea, and possibly a couple of other countries in due course. So thank you again. And now it's my privilege to ask Ofer Friedman from King's College to offer his thoughts. Thank you, Ofer.
Hello, everybody from London. Let me share my slides too. Yep. Can you see the slides, Greg? Are the slides available? Yep. Okay, so hello, everyone from London. And first of all, I would like to thank IISS and Greg specifically for inviting me to take a part in this fascinating webinar, and for organizing this whole series of events that focus on the use of cyber coercion. Also, I would like to thank Bilyana for her excellent and detailed overview of Russian cyber activities. Particularly, she saved me much time and effort, as I do not need to explain the history, potential, and the scale of Russia's capabilities in cyberspace. Instead, what I will do during my presentation, and I will try to be as short as possible, so there will be enough questions left, enough time left for the questions, I would like to simultaneously conduct two seemingly contradicting actions. First, I would want to narrow the discussion on coercion. As Bilyana brilliantly pointed out, Russia has been using cyberspace for different purposes. However, since the topic of our today's webinar is Russia's use of cyber coercion, it seems right to narrow the discussion on coercion and not other aspects of Kremlin activities. Secondly, I would like to elevate the focus of the discussion and address the role and place of the cyberspace in Russian strategy. As we will see, coercion is only one type of goals that Russia is seeking to achieve in cyberspace, which cyberspace by itself is only one dimension in Russian overall strategy. Therefore, it seems logical to try to understand how all these fit together. I hope that my attempt to present the topic, both narrowing it down and also elevating it, will make sense in the end, and will produce different illuminating perspective on Russia's use of cyber coercion. So since we're focusing on coercion, let's try to start narrowing topic down. The basic definition of coercion implies that it's the practice of persuading someone to do something using force or threats. Cyber coercion, in this case, is a practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats in cyberspace. And therefore, Russian cyber coercion, it's Russia's practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats in cyberspace. Therefore, to understand Russia's cyber coercion, we need to understand who is this someone, what is this something, and what are these force and threats in the Russian cyberspace. In other words, we need to understand whom Russia is trying to persuade by using force and threats in cyberspace, and for what purpose. In an attempt to answer this question, I would like to start with the last. What are the forces or threats in cyberspace according to Russia? And for that, we need to understand how Russia conceptualizing cyberspace. Because without this understanding, we step on a very slippery slope of mirror imaging and assuming that Russia understands and thinks about cyberspace exactly as we do in the West, which is, surprise, surprise, is not the case. My presentation disappeared?
Stopped, yeah.
Okay, let me reshare screen again. Technical difficulties, they usually occur in this type of things. Yes. Yeah, we are back in a moment. Yeah, okay. Sorry for that.
There we go.
There we go. So trying to conceptualize or understand what is Russia thinks about cyberspace, by reviewing Russian academic, official, and expert literature on this topic, it becomes clear that the Russians conceptualize cyberspace as an interaction between hardware, software, intersection between hardware, software, infrastructure, and content. While software and content are understandable, I believe that the difference between infrastructure and hardware should be emphasized. When we're talking about hardware, we're talking about computer hardware. And when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about physical infrastructure, which is controlled through cyberspace, such as a nuclear power plant, a hospital, a traffic control system. This is the infrastructure. So the intersection between these four elements constitutes, according to the Russian conceptualization of cyberspace, the cyberspace. So far, so good, and it seems that it doesn't differ much from what we will think of cyberspace. But this is where it gets interesting. The Russians divide the cyberspace into two separate, though interconnected spaces. The first is digital cyberspace that consists of hardware, software, and infrastructure. And the second one is information psychological space that includes software, hardware, and content. Let's try to understand how it works. So digital technical space is kind of easy. It's a nuclear power station or a hospital, for example, where we will have a software which different infrastructure is controlled by. We will have the hardware, and Russians actually also include the all operating staff as a part of this cyberspace, such as technicians and operators, and so on. Information psychological space, it's slightly different. It includes content, hardware, and software, and information platforms which operate and connect them all, such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others. So now, when we know how the Russians conceptualize and define cyberspace, let's see what is the designated role of this cyberspace in the Russian strategy. So the first type of sources when we're looking for the answer, what is the role and place of cyberspace, we need to look for Russian official documents, such as the cybersecurity strategy concept of the Russian Federation. Actually, it has never been adopted. It has been in the Russian Federal Assembly for almost a decade, and it has never been approved. And according to some Russian experts, it would never be approved, as the Kremlin, as well as many Russian experts, deem this concept unnecessary. Facing the lack of main cybersecurity doctrinal publication, we need to look for clues and hints in other documents, such as the Information Security Doctrine, the National Security Strategy, the Military Doctrine, and the Foreign Policy Concept. Another relevant and very interesting official document was published by the Russian Ministry of Defense in 2011, titled as the Conceptual Views of the Activities of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation in Information Space. To complement this, we will use also different products of the Russian academic and expert community. When we analyze all this together, in an attempt to understand the role and place of cyberspace in Russia's strategic thinking, we're coming to a very interesting conclusion. The Russians do not see cyberspace as a separate space or dimension. Instead, they conceptualize it as an integral part or a kind of subspace of informational space. An interesting outcome of this conceptualization is the fact that instead of calling their forces, their cyber forces, like the British National Cyber Force or American Cyber Command, they decided to call their forces responsible for operations in cyberspace as information operation forces and not cyber forces. These, in other words, by analyzing Russian official, professional, and academic discourses on the role and place of cyberspace, it's impossible to conclude that Russia sees both digital technical and information psychological cyberspaces as an integral part of their information space. Moreover, this understanding leads to another interesting conclusion, that Russia sees action conducted in both digital technical and information psychological cyberspaces as actions aimed to achieve goals in information space. And this is very important understanding. While it is easy to see how actions in information psychological space can influence information space, it's more complicated when it comes to digital technical. I would like to emphasize it. The Russians see actions in digital technical cyberspace as actions intended, first and foremost, to achieve goals in information space and not in physical space. In other words, a potential hacking of a hospital or traffic system or nuclear facility, first and foremost, is assessed for its potential to achieve goals in information space and not for the potential destruction, such as what destruction that this event can cause. Since the cyberspace and cyber activities are seen as a part of information space, we need to understand how the Russians define, in general, the role of information space in general and in international relations in particular. And this is something that brings us back to the Russian definitions of information war, which was already outlined by Bilyana, but I would like to read it again. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, information war is a confrontation between two or more states in the information space, with the aim of damaging information systems, processes, and resources, critical and other structures, undermining political, economic, and social systems, massive psychological influence on the population to destabilize society and the state, as well as forcing the state to accept decisions in the interest of the opposing side. I would like you all to read this definition very carefully. If you try to deconstruct this definition and analyze its meaning, you can easily come to the same conclusion that I came by myself. Information war, according to the Russians, is a form of hostile relations between states. I would like to emphasize two main aspects of this conclusion. First, it can be conducted only between states, because this is what they say. Otherwise, they will say political actors or include non-state actors inside their definition. So information war is an activity that we conducted between states only. Secondly, it is a form of international relations, a hostile, but still it's just a form. In other words, it sits together with other forms of different types of relationships between states, such as peace and war, cooperation, alliance, neutrality, and so on. Having this understanding, I would like to spend a few words on terminology surrounding the discourse about Russian information war in the West. Unfortunately, this discourse has been infected by misleading and even wrong use of strategic lexicon. As George Orwell observed, if your thought corrupts language, the language can also corrupt thoughts. In other words, if we don't use our language or our lexicon correctly, it will corrupt our thinking and understanding of what Russia is doing. Therefore, once we don't use term correctly, we fail to see the picture and understand the phenomenon which Russians are trying to describe, but also to implement. So first of all, information war, it's not information warfare, because war, it's not a warfare. Okay, and information war in Russian understanding, as we saw it before, it's a form of international relations. We should stop using these two interchangeably, because warfare is not a war. Secondly, Russians' information strategy and Russian strategy of information war. These terms simply make no sense. As we agreed, information war is a form of relations between states. To say Russia's information war strategy is similar to say America's peace strategy or China's war strategy. It simply does not make sense, because peace or war are the forms of relations between two or more states. And they can be waged, these forms can be waged by different strategies. Therefore, when we discuss Russian strategy, or trying to discuss connect between Russian strategy and information war, we should use term Russia's strategy in information war. Because Russians conceptualizing information war as the state of its relationship with the West. And in this state of relationship, Russia employs different strategies to achieve different goals. I would also like to warn you, instead of using other ambiguous terms such as Russian information war doctrine, Gerasimov doctrine, and all other types of other fruits of Western imagination and misunderstanding or misuse of strategic lexicon. There is no such a thing as Russian information doctrine, because this doctrine has never been published. And to say that it's a doctrine is mislead the audience. So to start, therefore, let's start to kind of conceptualize the relationship between Russian strategy and information in information war. Because once we can conceptualize the relationship and understand Russian strategic analysis, how it turns actions to support its national interests, we will be able to see a much bigger picture. So the easiest way to explain the strategic rationale of Russia's information war is by examining it through the conceptual prism of relations between national interest and actions. And it's not necessarily a Russian concept, it's just a concept to analyze the relationship between national interests that are translated to strategic goals, which are translated to operational goals and tactical goals. In the end, we will have actions which shape tactical environment and operational environment and geopolitical environment, and shaping back national interests. So it's a circle that goes constantly clockwise. And if we apply this concept on Russian understanding and conceptualization of information war, maybe we will be able to see a better picture. So when I apply this prism on the Russian conceptualization of information war, we can see the following picture. So to define Russia's national interest, I would paraphrase the slogan used by former, well, I don't know if I can already say former, maybe I will say last, or current US President Donald Trump. So it will we don't have time to discuss the whole way that Kremlin's vision of Russia's national interest did since the Munich speech in the mid-2000s, or the evolution of self-image of Russia through different foreign policy concepts. So I believe this kind of slogan does a good job to briefly and straight to the point describe of what Kremlin sees as Russia national interests. Now, this is Russian national interests obviously are shaped by the Russian interpretation of strategic geopolitical environment in which it operates, where Russia sees the US, NATO, and the EU as the most dominant players and its main adversaries. Therefore, the strategic goals in Russia's information war are to convince the US, NATO, and the EU, as well as third actors, that Russia is a great power again. Go and follow the circle. On operational level, Russia operates in the environment that, according to the Kremlin's view, is dominated by the Western soft power. Therefore, the operational goal in information war to undermine Western cohesion and influence while increasing the role of influence role and influence of Russia. Therefore, on the tactical level, Russia uses tactical events such as elections, Nord Stream, a Russian intervention in Syria, S-400 deal with Turkey, sanctions and counter-sanctions, the ongoing pandemic, the example of the case discussed earlier by the Estonian bronze soldier. All these are tactical opportunities and tactical events, which are trying to achieve tactical goals. Sometimes, depends on the target's political, military, social, and economic context, it can be subversion. On other occasions, it can be coercion. Sometimes it will be deterrence, and sometimes it will be persuasion. sometimes cooperation, and sometimes influence. And finally, when we get to actions, we get to all activities conducted by Russia, such as disinformation, misinformation, hacking, viruses, denial of service, and so on. I would like to emphasize this. Disinformation or misinformations are just tactics. And coming back to the misuse of a strategic lexicon, sometimes I wonder what people mean by they say the strategy of disinformation. To say a strategy of disinformation is just to say a strategy of Kalashnikov, or a strategy of how to conquer a hill by a platoon of Marines. It's a tactical action, misinformation, hacking, viruses, and so on in the Russian view of information war. But let's go back to our topic. Today, we're here not to discuss the overall holistic strategy of information war, but Russia's use of cyber coercion. In other words, how Russia uses cyberspace to achieve the tactical goal of coercion in a way that will serve its strategic goal. So cyber coercion, as we already know, it's a practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats in cyberspace. Cyber coercion within the context of Russian understanding of cyberspace is the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats in both digital technical and information psychological cyberspaces. Cyber coercion within the context of Russian understanding of its relations with the West as information war is the practice of persuading the US, NATO, and the EU, as well as third actors, that Russia is a great power, again, by using force or threats in both digital technical and information psychological cyberspaces. To conclude, and I don't have enough time, so I will briefly conclude, does it work? And here I would like to dispute Biliana, because I think it works brilliantly. Analyzing the perception, I believe it was enormously successful. Analyzing the Western perception of Russia in the last few years, it is difficult not to notice that the Russian strategy works. From Russia, that after 2014 was seen as politically isolated, economically sanctioned, securitized, under-legitimate country with very few options to improve its lot, by 2020, Russia has become a country that is not apparently capable to challenge Euro-Atlantic security, but also possessed some of the most sophisticated cyber capabilities in the world. Think even about the series of these webinars organized by IISS. 3 chosen cases were US, China, and Russia, and they were chosen not accidentally. The fact that we discuss Russian cyber capabilities today and not those of North Korea, Iran, or Israel is another sign of the Russia's success in its information war aimed to coerce us to think of Russia as a great power. And I will stop here. And
well, thank you.
I apologize again for the technical difficulties during.
No problem. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. It's a great compliment to the work that Biliana presented. I think you've given us a lot to think about. It's just possible that the Russian approach to information warfare may be the correct approach. So it's possible that the Russians are actually right about this and how they talk about it. And in fact, I was only reading a Russian article this evening, which really bears out the interpretation that you gave. So ladies and gentlemen, we have a good time now for comments or questions. You don't have to ask a question, feel free to comment. I'd be delighted to hear what you have to say. We've got 2 questions on the table, which I will just mention quickly, but I invite participants to use the raise hand function to offer a comment. We have plenty of time, so it'd be good to hear what you have to say. Use the raise hand function to vocalize a comment or a question. So let me mention these two questions we have on the table first, one from Nicholas McLean, asking about the role or the possible role of Russian information operations in the EU referendum in Britain in 2016, asking specifically whether there was a Russian fake news influence. And we'll take the second question at the same time. This is from Axel Prieto, asking whether we're seeing some information warfare aspects play out in reports of cyber operations against both research and distribution points involved in the COVID vaccine. So, Biliana, would you like to offer your take on these two questions first, and then we'll go to Ofer.
Sure. I also have a lot of responses for Ofer, and before I answer, I just want to say one. I very much agree with Ofer's statement about making Russia great again. I actually have a hat that says "Make America Great Again" in Russian. I decided not to put it on, but it's very appropriate for your term. Ofer, we can talk offline later on about a lot of your points. I find your presentation great and very stimulating. Specifically about the referendum from 2016, I don't think there was any proven Russian interference. There were analyses looking at different social media campaigns around this time that tried to assess, but at least from what I know, and Ofer, please do chime in if you have a different perspective on that, I don't think any specific Russian interference was definitively proven. With regards to COVID-19, there are a number of reports that show cyber operations against different research institutes that were developing the vaccine that were linked to Russian cyber threat actors. So that is something that there are reports by different private cybersecurity companies that I would encourage you to read. But yes, there is there are activities in this space from Russia as well as from China.
Okay, thanks, Biliana. Ofer?
Yes, I would like to refer to the question about UK interference. So first of all, as Biliana already pointed, there is no clear evidence of interference, but Russians achieved their goal nevertheless. Because if the goal of information war is to make Russia again great again, and influence us, coerce us to think of Russia as a great power, and following the investigation, the UK Intelligence and Security Committee of the Parliament says that Russia's cyber capability, when combined with its willingness to deploy it in a large capacity, is a matter of grave concern and possess an immediate and urgent threat to our national security. Job done. They don't need, we need to separate between what we see on the ground and what actions are trying to achieve. Russians didn't care who is going to win in 2016 elections, whether it's Trump or Hillary. We even don't know what they try to achieve, as Biliana pointed before. Well, if we look at this differently and kind of dive deep into the Russian thinking on the topic, they achieved exactly what they wanted to achieve. They wanted to achieve that we will perceive Russia as a great player. And all the elections and bronze soldiers and referendums and COVID and others, these are just tactical events, which outcome of which is not necessarily important.
Okay, thank you very much. We have some comments in the chat function. We'll give you the chance after the next round of questions to come back on the couple of the general points that Ofer raised, and I'm sorry that I sort of didn't foreshadow that a bit earlier. But let's take these questions that we've got in the chat function, if I could. The first one is around the US elections of 2016 compared with the 2020 situation. And as you pointed out, Biliana, we haven't really heard much about what happened in 2020. Would you like to perhaps go revisit that and just put on the table what information we do have? So that's a question from Fabio Bassani. So thank you, Fabio. And we have a question directly for Ofer. Do you see the potential for the Russian activities in the cyber domain to become strategy in the near future rather than a tactic as the cyber domain becomes more integrated in Western societies? And I did think when you put up that screen where you had coercion as a tactical activity, I put the question in my mind, under what circumstances could you raise it to an operational or strategic activity? The two questions on the table, perhaps first one for you, Bilyana, and the second for you, Ofer.
So first, I think we have to caution against thinking of Russia as 10 feet tall and thinking of Russia as a great power based on its cyber capabilities. As Ofer pointed out, Russia does certainly want to create the great power of Velикая Держава status, but there are also other elements that it's using in order to achieve that. One of them is nuclear weapons. And I believe, of course, we talk about Russia's cyber capabilities as being top-notch and Russia having one of the best most sophisticated cyber capabilities and cyber threat actors. And this is the case, but there's also a difference between perceptions, how they use them, and actual effects of those activities. Specifically in the 2016 elections, the Russians did care who is going to win. And this was made very clear by quite a lot of different investigative reports, as well as government reports by the IC, the intelligence community in the United States. FBI, NSA, and CIA came up with a joint report where they said that the operation was also directly authorized by President Putin. And there was specifically the 5 volumes of investigations from the Senate Intelligence Committee. I refer you to that offer if you want to read a little more about this, where the analysis concluded that the Russians, although in the beginning they didn't, towards the end of the election season, where it was clear that there were 2 candidates and they were Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the Russians had a very clear preference for Donald Trump for a number of reasons. One of them is the history of relations between President Putin, Russia in general, and Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton had quite a lot of different policies that were very anti-Russian and would affect the Russian government very negatively. There was also a personal, some scholars also would suggest that there was a personal feud between Hillary Clinton and President Trump, and for personal reasons, he didn't want her elected. So there, I believe, was a very clear preference. In terms of 2016, Russia's interference in 2020. So what do we know about 2016? And I kept on saying that in my remarks, that I'm basing my knowledge on the existing evidence. And I'm saying that because during the 2016 elections, information about different Russian activities kept on coming after the election as well. There were a lot of reports. The US Senate intelligence reports that I was referring to were released last year and this year. So almost 4 years after the operation, we still have new information coming about what exactly activities constituted Russia's operations at the time. So far, what we know about the 2020 elections, I would refer you to the 2 press releases by the ODNI, one of them from July of this year, the other one from August this year, where very briefly, the Office of Director of National Intelligence of the United States says that Russia was involved in, is involved in trying to interfere with the elections. There were no details provided in terms of the particular cyber operations or disinformation campaigns that the Russian government was behind. The FBI director confirmed that Russia was trying to interfere with the elections in September of this year in a statement. That's another statement you can refer to. And there was a particular, I believe it was a blog post, not an actual report, that was published by Microsoft, where Microsoft also looked at Russia's interference and pointed at the GRU as attempting to conduct cyber operations and trying to breach, I believe they specifically mentioned Pardee's campaign servers, as well as different government agencies in relation likely to the 2020 election. So those are the particular documents I would refer you to. I'm also hoping that we'll have more detailed studies, perhaps published by different government agencies. I'm looking at the IC, again, the intelligence community that was very good at publishing different reports on Russia's interference 2016 election. So maybe we can also expect more information on specific attempts, cyber attempts, even if they weren't successful. I think knowing about what particular attempts the Russian government was behind will also help us to understand how they have changed their playbook. And I hope we will see some of them in the near future.
Thanks, Bilyana. Ofer, in addressing this question about...
Yes, I will try to address it very quickly. The question.
Could I just ask one sort of elaboration on it? Are you comfortable with the word coercion to describe these sorts of activities that we've been discussing?
Of course.
Lexicon. Okay, good. Okay, good.
Sure,
okay.
Of course.
Yeah.
But 2 points. The first one, to continue what Bilyana said about interference in 2016. Well, there is no dispute about the fact that Russian information campaign was more supportive of Trump and try to undermine Clinton. There is no support, there is no dispute on that, and the data clearly shows that. But it doesn't say anything about Russian goals in this state, whether they will try to put Trump or they try to undermine Clinton, to have a weaker Clinton in the White House. And this, if this was the goal, they clearly overshoot and failed completely. So to claim that Russians try to put Trump or help Trump to get to White House, all our claims are very much circumstantial. We don't have clear evidence of that. It's the way we interpret it. The only thing that we can say for sure, what Russia successfully achieved is to get this image of great power or great threat among American decision makers. And this is the main, if you start reading how Russians conceptualize it, this is the main, this is the strategic goal. Now, regarding the question about cyber domain to become a strategy itself. So first of all, cyber domain, let's go back to the terminology. Cyber domain, it's not a strategy. Cyber domain is just a space in which strategic operations can be conducted or can be not. Now, the main question here, whether they would develop a strategic, cyber strategy as separate from information war, I'm not sure. I don't think it will happen in a feasible future, because they understand cyber differently, as I tried to underline during my presentation. They see whole cyberspace as an integral part of information space. So for example, when they speak or trying to conceptualize the idea of a cyber attack for the purpose of damage, not for the purpose of psychological influence, but for the purpose of damage, trying to hack a nuclear facility or hospital or traffic system, a control system, they don't care much about the damage. It's not a conceptualized in terms of the damage. Obviously, damage is considered there, but it's not about destroying adversaries' capabilities. It's about how this activity would influence information space, what the actors will think of Russia, how it will help domestic leadership or not help domestic leadership, and so on and so on. So this is very important to understand. When it comes to kind of physical destructions, Russians are very much happy with tanks and nukes. They don't see cyber as a destructive force per se. Obviously, it can cause destruction, but this is not its main goal. And I don't think it's going to change very soon, because this is engraved in their whole understanding of cyberspace. Where we in the West discuss cyber attack in this digital technical, so attacking nuclear facility as a replacement for nuking this facility, they don't discuss it. If they want to destroy facility or hospital, they can, if destruction, this is what they're looking for, they say we have tanks and we have nukes. But if they're looking for informational impact that a destruction can cause, this is where it comes from. Now, regarding your comment about coercion as a tactical goal, it's a tactical goal in the context of tactical event and local political, economic, and social context. So they can use cyber to coerce the West or deter I don't know, Azerbaijan, or to subvert Venezuela. It's different tactical goals in the tactical context, where the strategic goal is to make Russia or persuade the world that Russia is a great power in international relations.
Thanks, Ofer. So we have 4 further comments, and I'd really like to ask Alex Grigor after I pose these 3 questions and we get some answers. Alex, if you'd like to maybe switch on your mic for your question after we go through these next three. But first, from Nathaniel Beckett, we have a question about, was there evidence of Russian interference in the Scottish referendum of 2014? A further question from Fabio Bassani. In its interest in decoupling US from Europe in strategic relations, what would be Russia's primary targets of influence? And a third question from John Doty. Have we any evidence of Russian cyber operations of the sort we've been hearing about and information operations against China? You can take those three questions perhaps first, and then we'll come back to the that fourth question.
Greg, if I may, so I haven't seen any detailed official reports about Russia's interference in the Spanish referendum. I know that there were there was speculation about this, and I have read this as a case study in several different reports, but not a very detailed one. So if there was, it wasn't as much as some of the cases that I covered. Greg, in terms of the other questions, can you please remind me what else was on the table? I can't hear you very well, by the way.
I'm sorry, so I'll speak up, perhaps that's the issue. So in its ambition to weaken relations between the United States and Europe, what would Russia's primary targets of influence operations and information operations be? And then the third one was, what about Russian influence and information operations against China? Do we have any evidence?
I have looked into that. I haven't found anything substantive that I would be able to report and talk about in the moment. A part of an ongoing RAND report addresses the third question, but I'm not able to comment. Ofer, if you have any information on that.
Regarding the referendum, I already commented, and Biliana also commented. There is no clear evidence of that, but regardless, the UK Intelligence Committee decided to state that Russia is a big threat, and apparently great power when it comes to cyberspace. So mission done, job done from the Russian perspective. Whether they intervene or not, we don't know. Regarding China, well, there are obvious other aspects of information war with China, but Russia doesn't think that it's an information war with China. Because as we said, information war, it's in Russian interpretation, it's a state of relations between two states. And they don't see themselves in an information war with China. They use they use information in for other purposes, in other goals with China, but not as a part of information war, because this is not the state of affairs in their view of their relationship with China. So maybe some cyber techniques and cyber tactics are used against China, but not as a part of information war and not as a part of information coercion. It's for different purposes, maybe general intelligence gathering or sabotage or spying, which can happen, but not as a part of information war.
Thank you, Ofer. I think very good responses. So we have a rather complex question here from Alex Grigor, talking about comparing, in a sense, some of the observations that both of you have made about Russia's aims in this sort of activity. And he's asking specifically whether another way of understanding the Russian aim might be, in a sense, more profound systemic corrosion in the Western liberal system, so to speak. So we've talked about destabilizing these other countries. We've talked about having Russia be seen as a great power. Do you think that Russia has this interest in corrosive decay of the Western liberal system as part of its ambition here in information warfare?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I believe there are quite a few elements of this. This is a great question. And I think there are quite a few elements to look at into this. Cyber operations are certainly a part, as Ofer explained, of information space. And another element that Russia uses is also strategic messaging and disinformation. And those two are coupled together in Russia's concept of information warfare or information war, decided on how, depending on how we call informaционное противоборство. And another aspect here is when Russia wants to be viewed as a great power, there are also other elements to consider. Cyber capabilities, certainly we can include that as well. We look at their nuclear capability, they're still a great power based on that. Improved economy, definitely in comparison to the 19th, improved military morale. They have quite a lot of military investments and weapons systems. They have quite a lot to also demonstrate to the world. When it comes to cyber and perceptions, even if we don't look at particular case studies that I examined, and there's so many more that we can analyze, just the fact that in 2016, so much of our media attention was focused on Russia. And just the fact that this year, before the US elections, so many US government agencies and private sector companies were focused on trying to defend their networks and their systems from a potential Russian interference speaks to how much Russia has achieved just by demonstrating its cyber capabilities several times. Even if in those times they weren't successful, the fact that the Russians are willing to use them, and the fact that they generated such a response from different countries, especially the United States, speaks to the power and to the influence and effects that they've managed to achieve with their cyber capabilities. Ofer?
Yep, so we can agree that it was a successful operation, very much.
Actually, strategically, we differ
Yes,
a little bit, but yes.
The two comments.
That, yes.
First of all, we agree that it was a very successful job done. Secondly, warfare or war, it's not информационное противоборство, it's информационная война is противоборство. So let's put things straight. We will continue this discussion later. But coming to the question, I usually use a metaphor of marathon runners. When you have a leader who runs in the head, and you have one who lags behind. So let's say US, EU, NATO are those who run first, and Russia somewhere lags behind. There are two possible ways by which the second runner, those who lags behind, can bridge the gap. The first one is to run faster by developing economically and politically and socially, which Russia cannot. Putin understands the limits of Russian economic development. So the other way is to cause the others, those in the front, to run slower. And this is where information war is coming in. By the fact that despite that Russia is back there with the economy of size of Spain, we perceive it as a great power. We invest and redirect resources instead of in ourselves to, as Biliana pointed out, to protect ourselves from Russia. We direct resources, we direct attention. It creates internal tensions, either domestic, national tensions, or international tensions, which create friction, which force us to run slower. And this is what Russia is trying to achieve. So I think this metaphor actually helps to understand what and how is Russia trying to achieve to get to the first, or to get with a first running team, at least. And for now, because Russia understands they can't do it, so at least they create a perception of this. So by perceiving them as such, we run much slower.
So, Phil, well, ladies and gentlemen, we have two questions left, which I'll try and get done. They both demand short answers. The first is from Sergei Smirnov, who's talking about the connection between Russian government activity and cybercrime. So the Americans often express alarm that Chinese actions in cyberspace will do damage to critical systems, including safety systems. What's the connection between Russian official activity and cyber criminality? There's many reports about Russian government using cyber criminals to do official business. So that's the first question. Are there Russian officials engaged in corrupt cyber operations as well? And the second question is about possible Russian interference in the German elections coming up. And I'd like to link that to the question of how much we know and what we don't know. So, for example, in the case of the possible Russian interference in the UK referendum in 2016, my view as a long-standing analyst of Russian affairs is that if this is a government that's prepared to use polonium Novichok in the UK, it almost certainly, given all else we know, must have been doing something. We have no strong evidence in the public domain. What's your feeling about how we handle a presumption or an intuition of guilt, even if we don't have any evidence? And then we'll wrap up after that. So, Biliana, do you want to go first?
Yeah, those are great questions. Regarding criminal networks, before we had information that Russia was, or at least some criminal networks in Russia were supporting certain Russian cyber operations, for example, RBN, the Russian business network. But we had information about their activities in 2008, not later, specifically in the war against Georgia and a few other conflicts, but nothing in later years. A book that I would recommend to anyone interested in this space is by Turovsky. I believe his first name was Andrei Turovsky, who is a Russian journalist right now writing for Meduza outside of Russia. And he published a short book. It's called Short History of Russian Hackers. It is in Russian, and I very much hope someone translates it. I was thinking of doing that. It's just going to take me probably a few weeks of my time. It's an excellent narrative where he speaks. He uses interviews that he's conducted with various Russian hackers that have hacked on behalf of the government. And he lists there, and you can also find this in other research. A lot of scholars have covered this, but I found he's very actually insightful and comprehensive. The Russian government is known, or at least allegedly, uses criminals for its operations, and there are even certain rules and written rules that Russian criminal groups follow, and they are the Russian criminal groups never attack RU domains, so no attacks against Russian infrastructure. But when they are, one of the rules is when they are summoned to assist the Russian government in certain operations, they agree to do that, and the benefit is that they will not be prosecuted for conducting criminal activities outside of Russia. So from what we know, of course, the Russian government has never confirmed that, and I don't expect them to. But this is the information that we have. And so, yes, based on the evidence that I have seen and the people that I've spoken with, I believe the Russian government does use criminal groups, and whenever it needs, and whenever it needs to use them. And there are several benefits of that. One of them is that it also creates problems for attribution of those attacks, because it obfuscates attribution and makes it harder to attribute certain operations to state-sponsored groups such as APT28 or APT29 or Sandworm or any other APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Actor, that we would like to attribute to the Russian government, or we've attributed to the Russian government. Greg, what was, interference in the German elections, I believe, was one of them.
Go ahead.
There isn't anything substantive that I've seen so far, and I would encourage, when we talk about interference, we use the term very liberally. So we should look at cyber operations. We know of one successful cyber operation against the German Bundestag that was recently also attributed officially by Germany, that happened a few years ago. Another area of potential interference, and I'm again using the term very liberally, is with the particular narratives that the Russian government supports. We had the Lisa case from a few years ago, which resulted in actual protests. It was a case of a girl Russian origins that was supposedly raped by immigrants. It turned out that this wasn't true, but the Russian government did support the story before it was debunked, but the Russian government did support it for a period of time, and it resulted in protests, and also potentially influenced the support for ADF that became a part of parliament as a result of that. So I would also look at disinformation operations, disinformation narratives that may be advanced by or supported by Russian government or Russian state-sponsored media in Germany in this period.
Okay, thanks, Bilyana. Final comments, Ofer, on these questions?
Yeah, so first of all, regarding the involving crime or hackers, without citing any research, I would say that I'm almost sure for 100% that Russians do that, because, well, can you name me intelligence services that don't do that? Of course, well, we have a whole history of CIA operating criminal organizations in Latin America. So I would be very surprised if Russians don't do that. When we say Russians, who are the Russians? We're talking about GRU and other secret services. So if anybody can point me at a secret service that does not, to a certain degree, for certain circumstances, works with criminal organizations, I will be very much surprised. So this is on that. And about upcoming German elections, well, we know that Russians have history of operating in cyber domain in Germany. The question is what they're trying to achieve in these upcoming elections. Elections are tactical events. They're coming to serve a strategic goal of making Russia great again in the eyes of German leadership and German public. It's not about this candidate or that candidate. So the question is whether it's the simplest way to think about it's a propaganda of the deed on steroids. And whether there is a very important part of the successful propaganda of the deed is media and public. So as more we speak about that, as more, I'm not saying not to speak, I'm not saying to hide, but the question is, our hype actually serves the purpose. So if we approach this apolitically, professionally, we identify the threats, and because threats to national security should not be politicized. Because if we have threats to national security, they have to be addressed professionally by civil service, whether it's military, intelligence, and so they should not be politicized. Once we politicize it, we turn it into, we play to the Kremlin's head. Yeah, and I will stop here.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, it falls to me to thank Ofer and Biliana for an absolutely first-class seminar. There were some words of praise in some of the comments to that effect. A fantastic seminar, in the words of one colleague. So we're deeply indebted. IISS's work on cyber coercion has been advanced wonderfully by what you've said, and I'm sure we'll be in touch to follow up on some of the key points. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to show my appreciation for Ofer and Biliana. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.